experiencing the horror and the trauma as remains of their loved ones are still being identified. And families and communities still reeling from the events. All of us condemn the truly barbaric attack by Hamas terrorists on the 7th of October. And under international law, we respect countries' right to defend their citizens from terrorist attacks and also countries' obligations to abide by international law. The conduct of war matters. As Anthony Blinken has said at the very start of this conflict, how Israel does this matters. We democracies distinguish ourselves from terrorists by striving for a different standard, even when it's difficult. Our humanity, the value that we place on human life and dignity, that's what makes us who we are. And the rules-based order must not be abandoned. Yeah. And that's why we must commit to recognising the jurisdiction of the ICC to address the conduct of all parties in this conflict. Yeah. But it's also why we need an urgent suspension of hostilities, not just a short pause, but as my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has set out, the time and space to get in fuel, food, water, to rebuild vital humanitarian infrastructure, to protect aid workers who are losing their lives on a scale we have never seen before in conflict, to put in place protection for civilians and to negotiate hostage releases and to work towards a full cessation of violence and enduring peace so that lives can be saved and this intolerable suffering can end. And we know that requires immense and complex diplomatic work. It isn't easy. We have words on a page that we will talk about voting on today, but all of us know it's not the words on the page that's how this will be achieved. It will be achieved through step-by-step intense diplomacy and pressure that recognises how difficult this is when Hamas are refusing to agree to stop rocket attacks and their pledge again to repeat the attacks on the 7th of October. And we recognises too that hostages are still being held, but we still have to make urgent diplomatic progress. We still have to do what we can right now to save lives and to make progress in getting hostilities suspended, especially so that humanitarian action can be taken. And we recognise too that the only way forward is a two-state solution with a secure and safe Israel alongside a secure and sovereign Palestine. And my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, was right to say yesterday that neither the long-term security of Israel nor long-term justice for Palestine can be delivered by bombs and bullets. And that's why it's the responsibility on all of us to urge the UK government to do what it can to strain every sinew in the pursuit of peace.
The
original question was that an humble address be presented to His Majesty as on the order paper, since when Amendment R has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Secretary of State Alex.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the first duty of any government, its most serious and solemn responsibility, is to keep its people safe. Since 2010, overall levels of crime are down by more than 50%, domestic burglary is down by 57%, violent crime by 52%, vehicle-related theft by 39%, and the number of young people admitted to hospital following an assault with a knife or other bladed weapon has fallen by 26%. In fact, His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Andy Cook, has said that England and Wales are arguably safer than they have ever been. And that's because this government has taken decisive measures, including recruiting 20,000 police officers so that we can cut crime and keep our communities safe. We've made robust punishments available for the worst criminals to keep the most serious offenders in custody for longer, and we've commissioned the biggest prison building programme since the Victorian era. Now, the gracious speech builds on that record with a range of long-term decisions that keeps public protection at the heart of this government's agenda for our country. And I want to start with tackling violence against women and girls, a point that the Right Honourable Lady made. That is a priority for this government, and it's for me personally. But let us just step back to reflect on some of the progress that has been made in the last decade or so. The Right Honourable Lady referred to the offence of stalking, and she said she wanted to see some progress. She will recall that in the 13 years when she was in government, there was no offence of stalking. There was no crime. We are the party that created that crime, so that behaviour described as murder in slow motion could be properly addressed. Then we doubled the maximum sentence. I will give way, yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I'd correct him that he may not recall, but in fact I'd put forward one of the first amendments on reform to introduce a stalking law, and it was that same amendment that was eventually taken up in the other place by the Labour Lords and the Conservative government agreed to. So I'm very glad the Conservative government agreed to it, but I think he shouldn't take credit for agreeing to a Labour proposal that I and others put forward.
I am delighted to debate this with the Right Honourable Lady. 13 years and it wasn't on the statute book. When did it come on the statute book? 2012. She had 13 years. She missed her opportunity. This is the party that put it onto the statute book. So not only did we create the offence of stalking, described as murder in slow motion, we doubled the maximum sentence. She then referred to other matters of violence against women and girls. This is the party that created the offence of coercive and controlling behaviour. We are the party that slayed the myth that abuse is only perpetrated with punches, kicks and other physical violence. We know that it isn't, and we acted to outlaw it. We introduced the landmark Domestic Abuse Act 2021, creating a new domestic abuse commissioner and ending abuses such as the ability of DA perpetrators to cross-examine victims. We created a standalone offence of non-fatal strangulation and made clear that the cowardly so-called rough sex gone wrong defence to murder doesn't exist. We delivered radical improvements to the Victims Code to secure entitlements for victims, including the automatic right for eligible victims to be told when a perpetrator is due to leave prison. There is a 24/7 rape support helpline, over 950 ISVAs and IDVAs. We've outlawed upskirting, revenge porn, introduced the most wide-ranging modern slavery legislation probably anywhere in the world. And over the last year, we have built on this work. We have ensured that violence against women and girls is now recognised as a national threat, just like terrorism and organised crime, and it's also included in the strategic policing requirement. When I began, just a moment, can I just finish this point? When I began my career in the courts, violence behind closed doors all too often was passed off and trivialised as a domestic, with no action taken. Not anymore. We see it for what it is: corrosive, cruel, devastating. Those responsible are no longer beyond the reach of the law. Yes, I'll give way.
Can I commend the Secretary of State for bringing this forward? The Secretary of State will know, of course, the figures for Northern Ireland are the most worst in the whole of Europe. 27 women have been murdered in Northern Ireland by an intimate partner, relative or family member since 2017. The worst figures, and they're shameful and they're discouraging for all of us. Can I ask the Secretary of State this question? Would he encourage the Department of Justice in the Northern Ireland Assembly back home to follow suit on any legislation in relation to tackling violence against women and girls, so that Northern Ireland is not left behind?
Yes, I absolutely would, and I look forward to the restoration of the Assembly so that these important priorities can be pursued. So let me turn to the issue of rape, which was, I heard, sotto voce from the benches opposite. Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2021, we launched a rape review to drive up the criminal justice system's response to this crime. We committed to total transparency on the data, publishing dashboards about reports, charges, receipts in the Crown Court, so that any member of the public at the touch of a button could see what was taking place. We identified levers to drive forward the effectiveness and efficiency of the system, including rolling out technology to ensure that evidence from mobile phone devices can be harnessed rapidly without victims being separated for long periods from what can be a lifeline. We set out ambitions that many commentators thought were unachievable, and we brought government departments together, literally together, sitting around the same table to prosecute our mission on behalf of victims. Now, of course, there is always further to go. But the progress that has been made is very significant. The volume of adult rape cases reaching court since 2019 has doubled. Meanwhile, seeing as the Right Honourable Lady wanted to, how can I put it, put us under the microscope on this, let me make these points. The situation as compared to 2010 is striking. More cases of rape are being prosecuted. The conviction rate is higher. Sentences are longer. And this is important. The proportion of those sentences spent in custody has significantly increased too. And to the political points that the Right Honourable Lady made, I say this. She was in government and voted for the Criminal Justice Act 2003, Section 244, she wants to remember, which made sure that every single rapist was released at the halfway mark. If they were sentenced to 10 years, she voted to ensure that they were released after 5. We have changed that. This is the government that says that is not right, it's not fair on victims, and it's not just. And so she needs to account for her actions as well. We have invested £9.4 million in Operation Soteria, which brings together the police, prosecutors and academics to develop a new approach to rape and sexual offences. There is now a clear expectation that investigations must focus on the suspect's behaviour, not on the victim's supposed credibility. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to the police. Becoming a police officer is a noble calling. To sign up is to commit to running towards danger when others flee. It means engaging with the most threatening people in society, but also the most vulnerable too. That demands judgment as well as skill and integrity. And given the power that officers necessarily wield, it is essential that those who wear the uniform are competent, decent and honest. There are a small minority of officers who fall short of the required standard. And in recent years, some have transgressed in the worst ways possible. This inevitably shook public confidence in the police. Baroness Casey's review into the Met made for deeply concerning reading, and the first part of the Angiolini inquiry is focused on the career of the serving officer who raped and murdered Sarah Everard. Part 2 will look at broader issues in policing and the safety of women. Earlier this year, the government launched a review into police officer dismissals, and the Home Office has recently announced a number of measures to strengthen the system as a result of that review. There will be a presumption for dismissal for those found to have committed gross misconduct, and we are handing back responsibility for chairing misconduct hearings to senior police officers whilst retaining independence in the system. The College of Policing have strengthened the statutory code of practice for police vetting, making the obligations on police chiefs stricter and clearer. This was published in July, and His Majesty's Inspectorate has found that forces have made progress on vetting, for example. They must not let up. All police forces have cross-checked their workforce against the Police National Database to help identify anyone not fit to serve. The National Police Chiefs Council will provide an update on its findings in January. The government will change the law to ensure that all officers who are unable to maintain vetting clearance can be sacked. The Criminal Justice Bill includes a duty of candour, requiring police chiefs to ensure an ethical culture in their forces. And in August, the previous Home Secretary wrote to policing leaders asking them to outline their plans to increase visibility and confidence in local policing and to report back progress by March next year. Madam Deputy Speaker, confidence in policing is not just about individual behaviour, but also about the performance of each force. There is no such thing as a trivial crime. The public expect the police to follow all reasonable lines of inquiry, and the government has secured a pledge from all forces to do so. That pledge applies to all crimes, and the public expect to see improvements in the approach to phone theft, car theft, criminal damage and shoplifting. Madam Deputy Speaker, at the heart of the government's legislative programme for the forthcoming parliamentary session are our plans to keep the British people safe. And our sentencing bill has public protection at its core. And there are two elements to this approach. For people who commit the most horrific murders, such as murder with sexual or sadistic conduct, the public are protected by keeping them where they belong, out of circulation, behind bars for the rest of their life, unless the court finds exceptional circumstances exist. That's how they can be prevented from inflicting any more damage to individuals and to society. And so our bill also means that rapists and those convicted of the most serious sexual offences will serve every day of their custodial term behind bars. That is night and day compared to the regime we inherited in 2010. At that time, a rapist sentenced to 10 years was out in 5. Now, a rapist sentenced to 10 years will serve the full term. I will give way.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way. He's making an excellent speech and he is doing excellent work. He has not mentioned the crime of terrorism, which is one of the most serious crimes, and he hasn't had a chance to mention the amendments that we will be voting on today. There is grave concern that the greater the loss of civilian life that we see in the Middle East, the greater the likelihood of radicalisation and increased terror, both here and at home. So does he agree with me that those of us who do not see that this is the right time to call for a full ceasefire because of the difficulty of giving that ceasefire are not, by doing so, giving a moral blank cheque to Israel to continue with operations in the way they have done so far? And in particular, it is vital to protect civilian lives to prevent future terrorism here and elsewhere.
Well, look, I think the Honourable Lady puts it well. Anyone who's observed what's taking place cannot fail but to be filled with anguish and distress. So, of course, it's the case that a nation's right to defend itself is a right to do so consistent with international law, and the government is very clear on that. Indeed, I think as are most people in the House, but she puts the point well. And so, protecting the public, which is the theme that I'm seeking to stress, also demands, will you just wait a moment, can I just make a bit of progress and I'll certainly come to him, of course. Protecting the public also demands that we follow the evidence about what works to prevent reoffending. If reoffending goes down, crime goes down. If crime goes down, the public are protected. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Lord Chancellor, who was quite right earlier to reject the attempt at revisionist history from the benches opposite on stalking, where he and I worked very closely together on the initial change in legislation. Does he agree with me that there is an opportunity in the next police crime and sentencing bill to also address something that would help protect some of our young people, which is the issue of spiking? There is a real opportunity to update the 1861 law, give a clear definition of what spiking is, and send a very clear message to all those who might be tempted to do so.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? So he's absolutely right. So he did extraordinarily important work in respect of stalking. He understands, as I do, that it is a wicked crime that leaves particularly women feeling very vulnerable. We acted when others didn't, and revisionism is to be deprecated. I strongly agree with him. On the issue of spiking, he is a tremendous campaigner for this. He's right that the legislation that is apt to capture this offence is within the 1861 Offences Against the Persons Act. It does provide police with powers, but he makes a powerful point. He will continue to make them, and we will consider them with care. So if I can just move on. Oh, I'll take one and then I am going to move on.
Deputy Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He's making an interesting speech. I expect that he will share my disquiet that we presently have 600 vacancies for police in Scotland which are not going to be filled. And an independent counsellor in the Highlands called Matthew Rees, himself a senior retired police officer, said that the thin blue line is going to get thinner. So without these police, you can't do the sort of things that the right honourable gentleman is talking about. In other words, catching the criminals and making people feel secure. Could he, in his capacity, share his best practice with the Scottish Government in the future?
What a very kind offer, and I'm sure that call will be echoed by the benches in front of him. No, we of course would be delighted. We would be delighted to share any best practice. But look, he makes a very serious point. To do all the things we want to do to protect vulnerable people, that requires boots on the ground, that requires police officers. That's why we are proud of the fact that in this jurisdiction the number of police officers stands at or close to an all-time high. And we would, at an all-time high, and we would be happy to commend that approach to our friends north of the border. So I just want to deal with this point. On the issue of public protection, so one, it's taking the most serious offenders out of circulation because that's how we stop them committing crime. But we also want to follow the evidence about what works to prevent reoffending, because that's also how you keep the British people safe. And the evidence shows, not sentiment, evidence. The evidence shows that those on immediate prison sentences of less than 12 months are significantly more likely to reoffend than similar offenders who get sentences in the community. They are over 50%, one moment, they are over 50% likely to reoffend, as compared to less than 25% for those who are required to adhere to tough conditions, with the risk of going to prison if they fail to comply. So let me just be clear what that means. That means those who are on suspended sentence orders are required to comply with onerous requirements, be that unpaid work orders, be that alcohol rehabilitation requirements, or whatever, on pain of going straight to prison if they fail to comply. The evidence shows that people see that as a powerful deterrent. I will give way.
Well, my honourable friend will want to comment in that context on persistent offenders, because there are many offenders, he will know, that persistently offend and commit crimes that wouldn't attract a sentence of more than 12 months. The Right Honourable Lady spoke of shoplifting, for example. Criminal damage would be another example. Antisocial behaviour. That 30% persistent offenders commit 80% of crimes. Is he really saying that none of them should go to prison?
On the contrary, and I know my right honourable friend, rightly on behalf of his constituents, wants to ensure that those who destroy lives, who have a corrosive impact on communities, are brought to book. And that's why these provisions have been carefully constructed and calibrated to ensure that those who are unable or unwilling to abide by an order of the court can expect to hear the clang of the prison gate. Not only will, as it were, the proverbial sword of Damocles be hanging over them, but those who commit an offence when they are subject to a court order, be it a supervision order, a community order, a non-molestation order, then the presumption no longer applies. We send a clear message to criminals: obey the order of the court or expect to go to prison. So judges will retain their discretion to impose immediate custody when an offender poses a significant risk of physical or psychological harm to an individual. And this is to the direct point that the Right Honourable Lady made. So that domestic abuse offences and other violent offences against women and girls can and will continue to be punished with immediate custody, protecting victims. Nothing changes. But for those whose sentence is suspended, the courts will be able to continue to use a range of requirements, including curfews, electronic tags, community payback, and exclusion requirements. And those who do not comply or who commit further offences can be brought back to court and risk being sent to prison. Alongside this, we want to ensure that we have the prison places to keep serious and dangerous offenders locked up for longer, while allowing lower risk offenders to benefit from community-based restrictions to assist with their resettlement, get back into work and start contributing to society where that can be safely managed. And for that reason, we're extending HDC, home detention curfew, to offenders serving sentences of over 4 years and keeping our tough restrictions that prevent serious violent, sexual and domestic abuse offenders from accessing this facility. The Criminal Justice Bill includes measures which deliver on three strategic objectives, Madam Deputy Speaker. First, protecting the public from violence and intimidation. Second, enabling law enforcement agencies to respond to changing technology deployed by criminals, including by equipping them with sufficient powers to address emerging types and threats. And third, we're strengthening public confidence in policing. So we will protect the public from violence and intimidation by strengthening the law on taking of intimate images without consent and expanding the offence of encouraging or assisting self-harm. I will give way.
To the Minister, and we used to have happy times on the Justice Committee together when we were little scribbling things. But my question is, it sounds good what he's saying. Last year's Public Order Act still hasn't had the amendment that his Right Honourable friend for Harwich and I had put into it for stopping women using abortion clinics having intimidatory protests. It was passed, and that's the only section that's not been enacted. Ealing Council doesn't know whether to renew its temporary order. That's coming up again. Shouldn't have to if that law had actually passed and been enacted now. Can you tell us what to do in Ealing Council and the whole country where women every day face intimidation?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and we did indeed have a productive and non-partisan time on the Justice Select Committee. On the specific important point she raises, my honourable friend in closing will address that point, but essentially in due course. So we will protect the public from violence and intimidation by strengthening law on the taking of intimate images, as I've indicated. We will increase the multi-agency management requirements on offenders convicted of coercive or controlling behaviour. As I say, not an offence in 2010. We are implementing a further recommendation in the Domestic Homicide Sentencing Review, giving judges the discretion at sentencing to add a statutory aggravating factor for killing connected to the end of a relationship, many of which are committed where there has been a history of coercive or controlling behaviour. That man who says If I can't have you, no one will, can expect a more serious penalty. Finally, in a moment, it is a further insult to families when perpetrators refuse to appear in the dock to face up to the consequences of their actions. So it is quite right that we will give judges the power to order offenders to court and punish those who refuse. I'll give way.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and he's outlined some measures to protect women who face the really horrific abuse. One of the key areas I've been campaigning on is girls who are associated with gangs, and the fact that those girls are groomed, those girls are used by gang members for really horrific crimes, and those girls are then victimised and imprisoned. Does the Minister not agree that we should have a statutory definition of child criminal exploitation so that those girls don't continue to face that horrific ordeal they go through?
The Honourable Lady makes such an important point. I will, without boring the House with war stories, I remember defending a young woman. She was 17 years old, and she had been abused by her boyfriend, who put her under pressure to hold on to a firearm, a Mac-10 firearm. The police then, of course, arrested her, and she was at risk of a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years, whereas in effect she had been put under a lot of pressure by her boyfriend. Now, what I would say is that the courts do have discretion to take into account the personal circumstances, and indeed, in that case, where the court found exceptional circumstances, then it was not bound to impose the mandatory minimum. So it's always worth recalling that there is an opportunity in a fair society before independent courts for these important points of mitigation to be advanced. So we are also, to the point she makes, however, about grooming, I want to turn to this issue of protecting children. In April, the Prime Minister and the former Home Secretary announced a package of measures to tackle child sexual exploitation, grooming and abuse, so that our law keeps pace with criminals' latest warped ingenuity. We are introducing a statutory aggravating factor at sentencing for grooming behaviour in connection to sexual offences committed against those aged under 18 to tackle those involved in grooming gangs. There is also a new child sexual exploitation police task force. That means analysts in every police region, a new complex and organised child abuse database, and tackling organised exploitation programmes have been rolled out, which bring together force-level, regional and national data and intelligence. The Criminal Justice Bill also takes the fight to criminals. Articles used in serious crime, such as templates for 3D printed firearm components and pill presses, will be prohibited. The government has secured from the police agreement to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry, and this bill creates a power to enter a premises without a warrant to seize stolen goods, such as mobile phones. The operation of serious crime prevention orders will be strengthened to make it easier for police and other law enforcement agencies to place restrictions on offenders or suspected offenders and stop them from participating in further crime. This bill brings further action on the scourge that is knife crime. That includes creating a power to seize, retain and destroy bladed articles found on private property that are likely to be used in connection with unlawful violence. It includes increasing the maximum penalty for sale of prohibited weapons and for selling knives to under 18s. And it includes the creation of a criminal offence to possess a bladed article with the intent to use it in unlawful violence. And to increase the public confidence in policing, the Criminal Justice Bill provides for a duty of candour for policing and gives chief officers the right to appeal the result of misconduct boards to the Police Appeals Tribunal. I want to turn briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Victims and Prisoners Bill. This will enshrine the principles of the Victims Code in law, which provide greater oversight and transparency over how victims are treated, with criminal justice inspectorates undertaking joint inspections on victims' issues when directed to do so. And I would just make the point, as somebody who grappled with the old Victims Code under the party opposite when the Right Honourable Lady was in power, that was a pale imitation of what exists now. Under the code which was in place under Labour, it failed to give victims a right to review, it failed to give victims the right to make a victim personal statement, it only applied to victims of particularly serious crime, and it failed to give any rights to close relatives. Our Victims Code dramatically strengthens the rights of victims. It will be easier for victims of crime to make complaints against the public body by removing the need to go through an MP. It creates a duty on the police to ensure that requests for third-party personal records from complainants are proportionate and necessary, and this measure will apply to victims only. There will be an independent public advocate for the victims of major incidents who will help bereaved families and the injured in the immediate aftermath of a large-scale disaster, I will certainly give way to her in a moment, but not before paying tribute to her and indeed the Hillsborough families and others for campaigning for this. I give way.
Grateful to the Lord Chancellor for giving way, and I know he's taken an interest in the public advocate proposals, but will he agree that they need to be strengthened in order to be effective, and that his proposals as they currently stand are nowhere near good enough to do the job that I and others hope that they could do?
Well, I have been very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for the care and attention over many months and years that she has given to this sensitive area. We will continue to work with her so that this can be the best possible advocate. It is important to note, however, that whatever we provide will be a massive step forward. We, of course, want to get it right, and I commit to working closely with her to do so. The parole board will be required to include members with a background in law enforcement in order to help parole panels make better decisions in assessing risk. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the legislation laid out in the gracious speech is an ambitious, long-term vision for our country. It's one that builds on our record over the last 13 years to make our country safer than ever. It is a programme rooted in evidence, a programme which responds to the anger and distress we all feel about crime, and does so with measures which actually drive it down. So we will make sure the most dangerous offenders spend longer in prison to protect the British people from harm, and particularly to protect women and girls. We will equip the police with powers to fight the latest criminal trends which blight our communities. And we will ensure law enforcement has the confidence of the public whilst pulling on every lever to reduce offending, because that is what keeps the British people safe. At the death, I will give way.
I detected that my right honourable friend was in the closing part of his peroration, and I therefore would ask him just to address one concern I have about the policing of demonstrations. As it happens, I think the police made the right call about November the 11th, given that the law is in the situation that it is. But what I'm concerned about was that 3 weeks earlier, on October the 21st, a planned demonstration in Golders Green to pray for Israel and the Jewish people was called off after the police advised that it would be subject to intimidation or violence from people who were representing it as a threat against Muslims who are holding a demonstration for Palestine 7 miles away. Is he not concerned that a peaceful demonstration should be called off in the face of intimidation? And is it not a matter of concern that the people who were making those threats online that led the police to give that advice have not, as far as I've yet to learn, been in any way questioned, sought or prosecuted?
Well, my right honourable friend, as always, makes an extremely powerful point, and on the basis of what he said, it seems to me that that is troubling. I don't know all the details, of course, but the fundamental point is this, that anyone in our community, whether they are Jewish or otherwise, should be able to practice their faith without let or hindrance. And I'm very grateful to him for raising this as it has. If there are things that need to be followed up to protect our vulnerable communities, they should be. And so let me close with this. This is a bill that focuses on the evidence of what works, on the evidence of what keeps the British people safe. Sometimes that will mean people being locked up for longer, and we make no apologies for that. Sometimes it will mean ensuring that those who are capable of being redeemed are being redeemed. That's how you drive down reoffending. That's how you protect the British people, and I commend the government's programme to the House.
Before I call the SNP spokesperson, just to say that I will put a time limit of 6 minutes on immediately the SNP spokesperson has sat down. It may go down from that, but we'll see how we get on. SNP spokesperson Alison Thulis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, friends of mine will know that I run an occasional series on my social media about Westminster weirdness. And with this past week that we've had, I really don't know where to start with it. But I can congratulate the Minister on still being here, at least, to give his address. That's some progress, I suppose, for him, if not for the rest of his colleagues. Madam Deputy Speaker, I tend not to speak too much about justice in this place, because that is largely for the Scottish Parliament to determine. But in reading the King's speech, there are some aspects of the legislation that is being proposed where there is some relation to Scotland in what is happening there. I note particularly the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, and I hope that the Government will be engaged in closely, not just with the Scottish Government, but also with local government in Scotland, who may have an important role to play in the implementation of such a bill, given how the licensing regime works in Scotland for venues and premises anyway. They may have something to add to that, which might actually work quite well in Scotland. I know also the Investigatory Powers Bill, and I'm sure that ministers will want to work closely with the Scottish Government on this. And I note that certain provisions of the Criminal Justice Bill will apply in Scotland, and I look forward to getting some clarity from ministers as to which provisions of that bill precisely will apply in Scotland, and I'll mention some of these things later on. It was really quite shocking at the weekend to see the attacks on the police happening just outside this very building. Attacks that were encouraged in many respects by the very rhetoric coming from this government. And in many cases, it hasn't been a dog whistle in terms of the signal that ministers and their colleagues have been putting out. It's been a foghorn. And to see the far right out on the streets and the way that they did, bursting through the police, claiming police helmets as if they were some kind of, war victory, taking those trophies home, was really quite appalling. Also, to see the fallout from this further with Islamophobic attacks on women at stations in this city as well, which were really quite appalling and quite shocking. And I hope that those who perpetrated all of these attacks will be identified and brought to justice. Likewise, those that have been making anti-Semitic attacks against our Jewish communities need to feel the full force of the law. And in Scotland we do have quite recent hate crime legislation that the Scottish Government has brought in, and I'm sure that will be used wherever it can be to hold those who perpetrate such hate crimes to account. Recorded crime in Scotland remains extremely low. The most recent Crown stats show recorded crime at one of the lowest levels since 1974. And the overall number of crimes recorded for the year ending June 2023 was 4% lower than pre-pandemic levels in June 2019, according to the latest statistics on this. Remarkably also, Police Scotland has a 100% homicide detection rate, so every one of the very tragic murders that have been committed since the inception of the single service has been solved. And further to that, a significant number of cold cases committed many decades ago prior to Police Scotland have been detected using modern technologies and brought to trial, including the murders of Brenda Page from 1978 and Renee McRae in 1976. So there is lots still to be done to make sure that those who perpetrated crimes are brought to justice, and no one can rest until those victims do see the justice that they deserve, the loved ones that they have lost. We also need to do a good deal more around violence against women and girls. And the Scottish Government has led in many respects in this area with the Equally Safe strategy, which has worked well to try and do this, but there is always more that we need to do. The recently published Vision for Justice Delivery Plan also includes actions to address long-standing challenges in the system faced by victims of sexual offences and the continued modernisation of the prison estate. And setting out an ambitious programme of reforms that are being taken towards March 2026, the plan puts fresh focus on early intervention to prevent and reduce crime to make communities safer. It's not just, it can never be just, about locking people up, but prevention is incredibly important too. And the Criminal Justice Bill that the Minister talks about cracking down on things. And cracking down on things just means locking more people up. And for young people particularly, that will change their life chances dramatically, and it will have an impact on the rest of their life and their family's life. And the work that the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland has done over many years has taken this preventative approach to violence in young people, and violent offending in young people has gone down significantly as a result. And their work recognises that young people, particularly in this current era, particularly with the impact of the pandemic, and particularly being affected by the cost of living crisis, young people are really struggling with their lives. So they need all the more that intervention, that youth work that can be so powerful in changing their life chances. And I pay tribute in particular to Peak, Possibilities for Each and Every Kid, and the YCSA in Pollokshield, who have done such a huge amount of work over many years to tackle the issues facing young people in our communities. But we can't be complacent on all of this. We need continual work and continual investment in these services. And the Violence Reduction Unit also wish to highlight the work that has been going on around the Promise in Scotland for care experienced young people who we know from the statistics are sadly more likely to end up within the criminal justice system. And we need to continue to work with this group, learning from them and their experiences to make sure that their life chances are improved and that the promise is delivered upon. Another piece of work that has been going on in Scotland, further to the hate crime legislation that came before, is Baroness Helena Kennedy's work on the introduction of a misogyny bill to create new offences relating to misogynistic conduct. And any woman in this place will tell you about the scourge of misogynistic conduct, whether that is online in a kind of growing swell of hatred against women, or the challenges that are faced via social media and the attacks upon women there, or the way in which, as honourable colleagues mentioned earlier, that young women are drawn in to things that put themselves at harm, whether that's their sexual experiences online or the way in which these things are dealt with in our society. There needs to be a lot more work done to tackle misogyny in our society. There's also going to be a national rollout of a system to digitally transform how evidence is managed across the justice sector, which will benefit victims and witnesses and support a quicker resolution of cases. And we want to expand also in Scotland the availability of mediation services in civil disputes, which will save people time, stress and money if these things can be resolved at an earlier stage. I want to touch just briefly on drug policy as well, because there has been significant progress on this in Scotland in recent years. Yes, we have our challenges, we acknowledge those challenges, but we are putting a significant effort into tackling these. And I do welcome the mention of pill presses, particularly in the Criminal Justice Bill, because these street Valium on the streets of Scotland have been a particular scourge, being sold at very cheap prices with indeterminate strength and have been implicated in many, many deaths. So we need to tackle that at source. Again, a public health issue, not tackling those people that are taking those drugs, but tackling those that are forcing them out onto the streets. In the UK's approach to this, I would continue to urge the UK government to do something with the Misuse of Drugs Act. It is an entirely outdated piece of legislation that criminalises and harms people who have a health issue. And it's disappointing that the King's Speech did not see fit to tackle that, and also that the UK government have responded so poorly to the very strong and evidence-based report that the Home Affairs Select Committee has produced on drug policy in the UK. They need to learn from these things, not to continue to be guided by outdated and harmful ideology. So in Scotland, we've invested a total of £141 million in drug and alcohol services, and made huge strides in the increase in residential rehabilitation facilities, which are incredibly important to this. We opened the first national family drugs treatment service and a new mother and child recovery house in Dundee. We've also made a huge amount of progress, which is acknowledged in the Home Affairs Select Committee report, on medication-assisted treatment standards, which will help people to get that treatment when they need it straight away, increasing the uptake in residential rehabilitation placements and the availability of life-saving naloxone. I would encourage all members in this place, as I and my office team have done, to go for naloxone training. I had staff from the Scottish Drugs Forum come into my office and deliver training to me and my staff and another staff teams of colleagues on how to administer life-saving naloxone. It's a very simple thing to do. It can save a life. And as we are all out and about in our communities, it seems a very sensible thing that we're able to do. If you're taught how to do CPR training, it makes sense also to do something of this kind with naloxone. And that is something the Scottish Government has very much been a leader on. We've also implemented an enhanced drugs treatment service, which will deliver this heroin-assisted treatment to a small group of people. It's been incredibly well received and well successful for those that have been through that programme. Those that have completed the programme have seen huge benefits from having done so, and I look forward very much to the opening of the Safer Drug Consumption Facility in my constituency next year. It is not yet open, but I very much believe that it will do an awful lot to reduce both the antisocial behaviour of people taking drugs in the streets, in bin sheds, in closes, and in back lanes and on waste ground. It will bring those people inside where they can take drugs under medical supervision. Not one person has died in any of these facilities where they've operated in 100 cities around the world. I hope very much it will lead to a harm reduction approach in Scotland and help people get on the right track to staying safe and improving their lives. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to move on to move our Amendment H, that stands in the name of myself and my honourable colleagues, calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Middle East. Madam Deputy Speaker, I struggle to cope with dealing with the scenes of horror that are on the television screens every night. The horror of the 7th of October shocked us all, and the devastation since for the people of Gaza. Both of these things are incredibly difficult to process, how people can behave in such a way to their fellow human beings. I don't think I've ever received, even on Brexit, as many emails as I've had this past week, this past 4 weeks. Even overnight, I had 500 emails coming in from constituents who are desperately worried about this situation and are demanding a ceasefire now. I had to update the figures that I had and the remarks that I had here in front of me because the death toll has, of course, risen. At least 4,506 children in Gaza have been killed. One child every 10 minutes, more than 100 children every single day. A further 1,500 children remain missing under the rubble of bombed-out buildings and are presumed dead. The number of children killed in a single month of conflict in Gaza is more than 8 times the number of children killed in Ukraine during the entire first year of their current war with Russia. And many of the children that have managed to survive so far are sick or at risk of falling ill due to the lack of clean food or water. Oxfam have reported 5-hour queues at bakeries and a very real risk of starvation. Nowhere is safe from the airstrikes, not even medical facilities, which are protected under international law. And only one hospital in the north in Gaza is still operational, with very minimal service. The Al-Hali Hospital, which my honourable friend from Central Ayrshire has worked in, is very much struggling to keep going. And she awaits news from her colleagues, the people that she knows, as to whether or not they are surviving and what the circumstances are. Riham Jafari of Action Aid has commented on the concept of a humanitarian pause and says, "What use is a 4-hour pause each day to hand communities bread in the morning before they are bombed in the afternoon? What use is a brief cessation in hostilities when hospital wards lie in ruins and when roads used to deliver medical supplies and food are destroyed?" Action Aid have also talked about the situation facing pregnant women giving birth under bombardment. When you're giving birth, it doesn't really fit into a neat 4-hour humanitarian pause. Women are giving birth, having caesareans without anaesthetic. Babies are being born into chaos and death, where they cannot be guaranteed that a ventilator will be able to keep them alive. Wasim, an Oxfam staff member in Gaza, says, "Prices have trebled, the market is almost empty. There is a major shortage of essential foods and basic items. No bread, no dairy products, no salt, no milk, no canned food, no blankets or mattresses. Access to basic services is very limited. No electricity, no water, no gas, no health system and no education. We feel trapped. Civilians who have done nothing wrong ask us here in this House, how long can this go on?" Vivian Silver, the 74-year-old Canadian Israeli peace activist who founded Women Wage Peace, was confirmed murdered in the 7th of October attack on Kibbutz Be'eri. She was identified by her DNA. She had worked her whole life for peace. And when the attack happened, she was on the radio having a discussion from her safe room before the phone cut out. She was challenged on her views on peace in the Middle East. And even at that time when an attack was happening and she was in her safe room, she said, "We can talk more about this if I survive." Her bravery and her commitment to peace is what we should be listening to this afternoon. Yeah. Her sons who have lost so much, are seeking a ceasefire because they know this can't go on. We should commit to peace and to understanding in her memory. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, how does it end? How does this end? All conflicts at some point, they end. There's an armistice, there's an agreement, papers are signed. The question for all of us in this place is how long this current phase of conflict continues. When does it end? The UK are always keen to talk up their position as a P5 member of the United Nations. But what is that worth, I ask colleagues, when we don't back the UN Secretary-General when he calls for a ceasefire? And what reasonable circumstances should Antonio Guterres have to go to the Rafah crossing to plead for aid to get through? Why are we not standing behind the Secretary-General and behind the United Nations? Madam Deputy Speaker, if we do not strive for peace, we condemn yet another generation in Palestine and in Israel to a cycle of violence, to death and destruction beyond our imagination. We commit ourselves to a two-state solution, to justice and to peace. We will vote on the King's speech tonight. We will vote on these amendments. It will not end the 70-year-old conflict, but it gives us a place to begin.
Chair of the Justice Select Committee, Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say what a pleasure it was to listen to the Lord Chancellor open this debate and in the characteristically terms of moderation and eloquence that he brings to the dispatch box. Can I also welcome, if I may, my honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Orpington, and the honourable member for Newbury to the Treasury bench. They're both great assets to the government's team. I welcome very much what the Lord Chancellor has said in his speech. I'll concentrate upon the justice-related issues, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, given the pressures of time. Some of those are policy areas where, in fact, the Justice Committee has done work already, and I'm grateful to the Lord Chancellor and his ministerial colleagues for taking on board some of the issues that we have raised. We may want to press them a little further as the detail of the legislation goes forward, but I very much welcome the moves that they have made and very much appreciate their courtesy in our dealings throughout. Can I start with a report that we recently published entitled Public Opinion and Understanding of Sentencing? Important in the context of the sentencing bill and some provisions of the criminal justice bill. That report showed that there is a real problem with a lack of a coherent approach to sentencing policy in the UK, as well as an issue with public understanding of the objectives of sentencing, and that in particular involves insufficient analysis of the potential impacts of sentencing changes. It's not something that's unique to the last few years. That has been, I think, systemic in all the time I've been involved in politics, and probably in all the 30-odd years that I spent in practice at the bar, specialising in criminal work before I came to this place. So it's something that no government particularly holds blame for, but systemically we have perhaps not done enough to use data efficiently and fully, to collect it adequately, and then use it to drive policy in a much more evidence-based way. I know that the Lord Chancellor and his colleagues understand that, and I know that the Department is making moves to very much improve that, and I welcome it. And these are bills, perhaps examples where we can try and put some of that into practice. That's certainly what our Select Committee report is looking to achieve. Now, given the views of the public, that protection of the public is the top priority, and we came to this conclusion after a very detailed sentencing exercise, I might add. I don't think people object to stronger sentences for the most dangerous offences. But I think equally we need to be alert to identifying any potential unintended consequences. That means that we have to level with the public. If we are repeatedly enacting measures which increase sentencing under a mantra of being tough on crime, we have to be honest with the public and say that will cost money. To keep an adult male in prison costs £47,000 a year. Now, if it's someone who's a danger to the public or has committed the worst types of crimes, that's money well spent. But we're quite right, and the Lord Chancellor is quite right, to look at alternatives where that money can be better used for those who are not a danger, are, in many respects, inadequate, in many respects have been failed much further on and earlier on in their lives and have got into a chaotic situation. Not always tougher sentencing, that's sometimes part of the mix, rightly so, but it's usually smarter sentencing that's really important to this. And I think the bill recognises that and gives us an opportunity to build on it. And that's important too because of the capacity crisis that we have identified in prisons through our study of the prison workforce, where we have real difficulties in recruitment and retention. That is important too. You cannot do the rehabilitation without sufficient adequate staffing. And as Winston Churchill said, there is in truth a treasure, a gold treasure in the heart of almost every man. Not everyone is redeemable, but very many are, and far more than sometimes people in politics think. And it's a good thing if we can turn people's lives around through the prison system, because it means less reoffending. And that's why the presumption against shorter sentences is right. There are certain areas been referred to that we need to look at the detail carefully, but overall the evidence is overwhelming that short sentences do more harm than good. Sentencing policy should be about evidence and preventing reoffending, not about sound bites and grabbing headlines. I know that's the approach that the Lord Chancellor adopts. Once and once only, because time presses.
Giving way. These are the arguments that have been used for most of my lifetime. Recidivism was caused not by punishment, not by retributive justice, but somehow that was less important than, as he said, the fact that the people who commit crimes have somehow been failed. Despite the fact that that's the prevailing view in criminal justice for a long time, there's been no decline in recidivism, rather the opposite.
Before the Honourable Gentleman comes back, I must point out that if those who are trying to catch my eye later intervene before they've spoken, they will get moved down the list. Sir Robert Neal.
A lifetime of holding a particular mindset that's not supported by evidence isn't anything I personally will boast about. I follow the evidence. The evidence is that short sentences do harm more than good. The government has got the balance right with respect to my honourable friend. I don't think those who take a contrary view do. Prison does not always work. It works for the worst cases, but not for everybody, and let's be honest about that. And that's exactly what the Lord Chancellor is trying to do. Can I also then look at the Criminal Justice Bill? I hope when finally on sentencing, I'm sure when we have the bill around sentencing, we'll have a proper impact analysis on prison places and demands. Criminal Justice Bill, I think we all recognise that when people thumb their noses at the victims of crime, that people expect them to be able to be seen and hearing the court pass judgment. But I welcome the tone that's adopted in the Criminal Justice Bill. That's to say, ultimately, the discretion must rest with the judge. It's fair to give the judge a further tool in the toolbox to use, but there will be cases, as the Lord Chancellor and I know, and we've seen it, where people try and hijack the proceedings to grandstand or actually to behave in a disruptive way. The use of reasonable force is a well-established concept. We don't want people actually being dragged up at the risk to prison officers who do dedicated work and put their health and lives on the line anyway. We've got to get a balance on that. I think the bill achieves that, and I commend the Lord Chancellor for dealing with a sensitive topic in that way. And I hope too we will see then in the Victims and Prisoners Bill the opportunity to take forward some of the suggestions that we made in relation to sentences for IPP sentences for public protection. We made a number of recommendations. Some I know the Lord Chancellor has taken forward. I believe there is scope for more. He knows about my views on resentencing, but also in particular the way the life licence works. And I'm sure there's an opportunity greatly to improve that, so that we don't have people being set up to fail to start with. These are good and sensible measures in this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome them, and I hope the House will support.
Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Deputy Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be called to speak in the King's Speech debate on policing and criminal justice. As the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I'm very pleased that policing is getting the attention it rightly deserves. But I would say to the Government that far more needs to be done quickly, particularly around vetting and dismissals of police officers who should not be serving in our police forces. And on the issue of specialist units for investigating rape and serious sexual offences, it's disappointing that not all police forces have those in place. A spiking offence, that's something that the Home Affairs Select Committee has also called for, along with the Honourable Member for Gloucester, I think. And in recent weeks, I think the Home Affairs Select Committee is concerned about whether we have the correct laws in place to deal with some of the protests that we've seen and this issue of hateful extremism. So we're hoping that the government might address that as well. I totally agree with the calls for a statutory definition of child criminal exploitation, and the Home Affairs Select Committee has been calling for that for some time. And after today's judgment on the Rwanda policy, can I commend to the government again the Home Affairs Select Committee report on small boats, which we published last year, which has a range of policy options which the government might want to look at again. We certainly look forward on the committee to working with the Home Office and ministers, scrutinising proposals and policies that are based on evidence and based on a fully costed model. I want to specifically refer to the government's draft Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, also known as Martin's Law. The government is now planning to conduct a consultation before tabling the bill in Parliament, and before responding to the pre-legislative scrutiny that we conducted on the committee in the summer. However, I do think it's worth remembering that that bill is a response to the terrorist attack at the Manchester Arena in 2017, the recommendations of the inquiry, and is designed to help prevent such an appalling crime happening again. I want to pay tribute to Figan Murray, the driving force behind this legislation, whose son Martin Hett was tragically killed in the Manchester Arena attack. And I hope that ministers will be able to confirm what the exact timetable is for the consultation they're holding and exactly when they plan to table the bill in Parliament. The second issue I just wanted to talk about this afternoon is the infected blood scandal. Sadly, we've learnt from the King's speech that the government's priorities for this session do not include delivering justice to victims of the infected blood scandal, the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. This is, of course, despite the government accepting the moral case for compensation, despite repeatedly assuring us that they were working at pace, ready for the infected blood inquiry to report this month, and despite having received final recommendations 7 months ago from Sir Brian Langstaff on compensation, not to mention Sir Robert Francis KC's framework document, which was given to the government 20 months ago. The government didn't even pledge to extend interim payments to bereaved parents, children and siblings, as proposed by Sir Brian Langstaff and recommended very clearly in his report. And I'm sure members across the House whose constituents include those infected and affected by the contaminated blood scandal will join me in voicing our deep disappointment that after 50 years and 5 years of a public inquiry, with one victim dying on average every 4 days, this King's speech is yet another wasted opportunity. I have therefore tabled Amendment Q with cross-party support to try and put this matter right. Let's be clear. The government has had all the information and time it could possibly need to set up a compensation scheme. It appears that the missing ingredient is political will, and that's not surprising. With the appointment of the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury this week as the latest Paymaster General, we've had 9 holders of the post since the infected blood inquiry started in July 2017. Those receiving infected blood are not to blame for what happened to them, and the decades of delays is getting to where this issue now stands. And they're certainly not responsible for the current state of public finances. And I, along with colleagues on both sides of this House, will continue to push the government every step of the way until they finally do what is right and deliver justice for this group. My final comments relate to my own constituency of Hull. And I just want to say to the government, I'm really disappointed that the King's Speech didn't have anything in it to deal with the bread and butter issues that my constituents care about. One is about the failure of being able to access NHS dentistry. There are many parts of the country this affects. There's nothing in the King's Speech to deal with that. Secondly, there's nothing to deal with the fact that the government changed, when it was the coalition government, the requirement for planning permission for companies when they want to erect telegraph poles outside people's houses to extend broadband connectivity. They can just do that. And in Hull, we're finding now we've got 3 or 4 companies who are doing this without local residents really being able to have a say in this. And I hope the government will look at this again, and I've tabled a private member's bill on that basis.
Deputy Speaker, I want to speak mainly about the various bills that are designed to make our streets safer, almost all of which I fully support, with one detailed exception I will come to. But I also want to express briefly regret about 2 absences from the gracious speech. The first is the absence of any changes to the social care system, a system which has been creaking for years, and which the government's solution has been to give it some more money as a sticking plaster every year. I think we need much more radical change than that. We need a proper workforce plan, a strategy to keep older, frailer people in their homes for longer, both by redesigning housing and by using technology, and of course, underlying it all, a much more stable funding system, not relying on council tax, which is a big problem. And the other absence, I think, is indeed Amendment Q, which the Honourable Lady from Kingston upon Hull has just referred to, and I have signed her amendment. And as she said, this is a scandal that has been going on for a long time, in fact so long that she referred to when it first came under the purview of the Cabinet Office, so long ago that I was the Minister responsible for it then, and the fact that 6 years later we've not made enough progress is, I think, hugely regrettable. But let me turn to the criminal justice aspects of the bill. They are clearly necessary. They are central to restoring public confidence in the way we live in this country. And even in a relatively prosperous, relatively peaceful constituency like mine, there are significant worries about areas like town centres, which people feel are less safe. Now, some of this does require legislation to address. Obviously, that's not the whole answer. Equally important is the very welcome increase in police numbers that we have seen in recent years. And I'm delighted to congratulate both the ministers and indeed Kent's Police and Crime Commissioner, Matthew Scott, that we now have the record number of police in Kent ever. And that, I think, is a significant step forward. But there is always more to be done. And some of the more that needs to be done is indeed done in this King's Speech. I think the sentencing bill strikes the right balance. I'm very happy to see the most dangerous criminals in prison for longer. But also, I echo my honourable friend, the chairman of the Select Committee's welcome for the provisions on shorter sentencing. I think it is a legitimate question, as my right honourable friend from South Holland and Deepings rose about recidivism. And again, I mean, looking at the facts, that the short sentences of less than 12 months have a reoffending rate of 55%, so you're more likely than not to reoffend if you have had one of these short sentences. If you have a suspended sentence order with requirements, the reoffending rate is 24%. It's less than half. So I think the evidence is pretty stark that these short sentences are not working to address the problem he very legitimately brings up. On the criminal justice bill, I support almost all of its provisions very strongly. I'm particularly keen on introducing a statutory aggravating factor at sentencing for those involved in grooming gangs. I'm very much in favour of increasing the multi-agency management requirements on offenders convicted of coercive or controlling behaviour, because other agencies need to get involved as well as the police. And I am particularly keen on measures to tackle violence against women and girls, where many people on both sides of this House, and indeed outside, many police and crime commissioners, I know, have done some good work. I am, I have to say, less convinced by the proposal to give more powers to the police to enter homes without a warrant for various reasons. There are perfectly good powers the police have under the PACE Act, the 1984 Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which give them various powers to enter houses. And I'm not convinced by the arguments that have been produced by ministers for needing more. And indeed, I was even less convinced when I read the explanatory notes to this bill, who tell me that after a Law Commission report, which was published in 1920, the Law Commission found that the process for applying for search warrants was extremely inefficient, and delays caused by this increased opportunities for evidence to be lost. So we have an important safeguard in place, the need for a warrant, but we are extremely inefficient in using it. So instead of becoming efficient in using it, we will dispense with the safeguard altogether. I put it gently to colleagues on the front bench that this is completely disproportionate and frankly not the sort of thing a Conservative government ought to be doing. So I hope my right honourable friends will think again about this particular part of the bill. In general, though, as I say, I am very supportive of the criminal justice and sentencing measures in this bill. I think they are both necessary and timely, and I think they can build on the successes that we have seen in recent years under many Home Secretaries in enabling the police to prevent and fight crime more effectively. And they are a significant part of what is a good set of measures in the King's speech, and despite my individual caveats on that one measure, I will be proud to support the government in the lobbies at the end of this debate tonight. Thank you.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak to amendments B and H. On Monday night, the Prime Minister made a speech setting out a vision for a foreign policy with morality and values at the very heart of it. Yet the absence of anything in the King's speech that even comes close to promoting the UK as a positive and outward-looking nation shows that this government embodies neither morality nor values. Indeed, a foreign policy with morality at its heart would not leave over 2 million Palestinians trapped in a humanitarian nightmare without food, water, medicine or power. And a foreign policy that puts values first would not be following the direction set by Washington and the United States in addressing this conflict. A foreign policy that is built on morality would not stand by as over 11,000 Palestinians are killed, as more than 27,000 are wounded, and as 7,500 women and children have their lives taken from them, or as schools, hospitals, churches, mosques, refugee camps and homes are reduced to rubble. And a foreign policy that is driven by values would not still be advocating the 4-hour pauses that do nothing to alleviate the suffering of innocent men, women and children, and do nothing to end the violence that those living in the region have faced for decades. A foreign policy of morality and values would also not leave this government unable to answer just how many Palestinian lives it would take before they condemn the actions of the Israeli military in Gaza, which continue to violate international law, continue to stand as acts of collective punishment, and continue to fall within the definition of war crimes as they so clearly do. Madam Deputy Speaker, instead a foreign policy of morality and values would be advocating front and centre a ceasefire that ends the bloodshed, allows desperately needed aid to reach those most in need, and creates space following the safe return of hostages for meaningful negotiations on a lasting peace. Madam Deputy Speaker, with over 11,000 Palestinian civilians and 1,200 Israelis who have been killed since the 7th of October, and tens of thousands more wounded, it's clear to me, clear to the United Nations, and clear to every single aid agency operating on the ground in Gaza that a humanitarian pause just doesn't do enough and doesn't go far enough. The innocent men, women and children of Gaza who are trapped in the never-ending nightmare of conflict, which they did not start and which they have no power to end, do not need a pause. They need it to stop. And the only way that we can achieve this is with a real and immediate ceasefire. Madam Deputy Speaker, I remain clear in my belief that it is the right thing to do, that it's the right choice to make if we want to see an end to the bloodshed and a lasting peace in the region, which no humanitarian pause will ever be able to achieve. Madam Deputy Speaker, and that is why I stood down from the opposition front bench. I'm here also advocating for a ceasefire rather than brief humanitarian pauses, because without a ceasefire, without a real break in the fighting, we will just see the unimaginable suffering, the horror, the death, the destruction and the devastation unfolding in Gaza continue. Without a ceasefire, the bloodshed that has already left thousands of innocent civilians dead, that has wounded so many more, that has left children without parents and robbed parents of their children, and which sees premature babies left to die outside their incubators, will tragically continue. Without a ceasefire, the desperately needed aid and assistance, the food, water, fuel and medicine that Palestinians urgently need and cry out for will not be able to safely enter Gaza. We will not be able to reach those who are most in need, and will lead to the deaths of many hundreds and thousands more. And without a ceasefire, the negotiations working towards a peaceful resolution and a real two-state solution, which the region cannot wait for any longer, will simply not have the space nor the will to succeed. That is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am supporting the ceasefire amendments today, and why I will continue to advocate for a ceasefire to stop the bloodshed, enable desperately needed aid to reach those most in need, and create space for meaningful negotiations. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And there is a rich and sad irony in today's debate on the amendments on a ceasefire in the law and order context. Here is the UK Parliament soon to vote on a ceasefire in a conflict over which the UK has no control, and a ceasefire which neither side in the actual conflict actually want. Hamas openly say they will fight on to kill as many Jews as possible, not Israelis, Jews, and that they would do the 7th of October all over again if they could. They openly say that. Israel will destroy Hamas and will be doing the world, and indeed the Palestinian people, a great service by doing so. A ceasefire would play into the hands of terrorists and terrorism. And the Scottish nationalists have engineered an amendment to this debate, amongst others, to incommode and undermine the Labour leadership. But what they actually undermine is community cohesion and the Jewish community in this country. And I want to address, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Jewish community in the United Kingdom. Now, there is a great deal of fear in the Jewish community, who feel decidedly unsafe and abandoned, vulnerable and isolated, and who have effectively been banned from central London for several weekends now by the risible failure of police actions and the one-sided prejudicial reporting of the BBC and others. These factors have an adverse effect on law and order, as well as on diplomatic moves internationally. We hear deep hatred for Israel from multiple quarters. Why do we not see mass demonstrations and similar responses when hundreds of thousands of Muslims and others are killed in conflicts elsewhere? 600,000 civilians, including children, killed in the last year in Sudan, 300,000 killed in Yemen, countless dead in Ethiopia, Tigray, Azerbaijan, Armenia, China's hard-oppressed Uyghur Muslims, the wonderful Kurds attacked by Turkey, East Timor and so on. It is difficult not to come to the conclusion that the screaming about Israel is based on the ancient hatred of anti-Semitism. Why else ignore larger losses of life? So we see hate, we see dissent, and we see division. But I would like to appeal today to a different emotion in the limited time available, and that is hope. And I say to the Jewish community in the UK and those in any faith or of none who yearn for peace and reconciliation, be of good hope. There is, in fact, much to be hopeful about. Why? Well, one of the prime reasons for the timing of the ISIS-style pogrom of the 7th of October was the blooming flower of a relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It was apparently a few months away from fruition, and what a wonderful development that would have been. The Saudi position is such, as the keeper of the holy places, that perhaps a dozen Muslim-majority countries would have soon followed suit and opened relations with Israel. But all is not lost. The good news is that this will still happen, and the signs are that the Saudis will still pursue this project, and for Jews and many others yearning for peace, it is something to look forward to. It would build on the historic Abraham Accords of 2020, when Bahrain and the UAE bonded with Israel, and that arrangement has borne rich fruit. And there are reasons to be hopeful also even with Iran. Why there? Well, the theocrats in Tehran are irredeemable. They support and fund terrorism in many areas and oppress and torture their own people. But in due course, the evil designs of that clerical cabal will fail, just as the evil designs of so many others motivated by hatred have failed. The Iranian people are a wise and cultured people, and there is much to hope for there. Recently, the people of Iran have been encouraged by their regime to chant slogans against Israel and trample on large Israeli flags placed deliberately for the purpose at the exit of football stadiums and other stunts, but the Persian football masses pointedly declined to do so. What bravery and what nobility, and a good sign of hope for the future. And what about here in the United Kingdom, Madam Deputy Speaker? What hope can we look to here? Well, I think a lot. We have seen gangs of proto-fascists, frankly, crowd around, for example, Marks and Spencer's branches. One in Glasgow, and I wonder why the SNP don't wish to mention that in debates. But the reality of the matter is that that is because Marks and Spencer's was once a Jewish-owned company. But since 1926, owned by thousands of shareholders, subject to anti-Semitic attacks now, 130 years after its foundation. Mr. Marks first came to the UK escaping, actually, ironically, from another pogrom, this one in the 1880s. But there's hope even there, because I can tell this House, Marks and Spencer's thrives like never before. Its shares are up 66% this year. But there's even more of hope elsewhere. We have a Prime Minister who has supported Israel. And yes, we have a leader of the opposition who has withstood the brickbats and those who wish to divide and is defending the Jewish people from insult and prejudice. And we have a sovereign, a king, Madam Deputy Speaker, who is a global leader and who will be a source for peace. There is no better hope than that.
Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We can't discuss confidence in the criminal justice system and policing without tackling the long and balefully negative influence of the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster, which, whilst over 34 years ago, has hugely impacted the way in which police and public authorities are seen across Merseyside and beyond. The impact is widespread and intergenerational, and more needs to be done to tackle it. I hoped we would see a Hillsborough law in the legislative programme to learn the lessons of the tragedy, in which 97 people were unlawfully killed by the gross negligence of the police responsible for keeping them safe. To date, none of the South Yorkshire police responsible for the disaster or the subsequent cover-up and campaign of vilification has been held to account, and now probably never will be. Whilst families of the dead and survivors have endured decades of wrongly being blamed for what happened and feeling they have to defend the reputations of their loved ones from the ongoing ignorant attacks spawned by the South Yorkshire Police's deliberate campaign to shift the blame from themselves. And it's particularly difficult for families to feel frozen in time being forever dragged back to the darkest of their days as they have to keep repeating to ignorant people what really happened and the findings of the unlawful killing at the second inquest, the findings of the Hillsborough Independent Panel, the truth of Hillsborough, in other words. Yet the police campaign, aided by some newspapers, was so powerful and has been so enduring that still we hear tragedy chanting at football matches, blaming Liverpool fans for what happened. One of the biggest comforts families of those who died and survivors who still suffer to this day could have is the assurance that Parliament has taken steps to prevent this kind of problem from recurring in the aftermath of tragedies such as this. Yet we've not done so. That's why I've been introducing my Public Advocate Bill, repeatedly blocked by the government since 2016. That's why I support the more general call for a Hillsborough law to try and prevent what happened after Hillsborough ever again affecting the victims of families who through no fault of their own are caught up in public disasters and then find themselves treated with indifference or hostility by public authorities and their feelings ignored. There have been disasters since Hillsborough. There'll continue to be more, although we must hope to keep them to a minimum. The Hillsborough law aims to rebalance the scales of justice towards families bereaved by public disasters and survivors by establishing a public advocate independent of government and able to act at the behest of families affected after major incidents, to give them a say and to use the learning from the Hillsborough Independent Panel process on the huge power of transparency to stop things going wrong as they did after Hillsborough. A statutory duty of candour on public servants, not just the police, though I welcome the fact that the government are to legislate on a duty of candour for police. This could only help make things better, but by itself won't be enough to prevent a recurrence of an event such as Hillsborough. Proper participation of bereaved families at inquests through publicly funded legal representation and ensuring equality of arms by ending limitless use of public authorities' budgets to defend their reputations on those occasions, no matter what the circumstances, and making Bishop James Jones's Charter for Families Bereaved Through Public Tragedy, which has been voluntarily signed by some, legally binding on all public bodies. Now, the government's recognised for years that there are things that need to be changed, but I'm afraid they've been lamentably slow in doing anything about it. Bishop James Jones' report, which was asked for by the Right Honourable Lady for Maidenhead when she was Prime Minister, was published in 2017. Over 6 years later, there hasn't been a response to it. I find that quite shocking. Now, I've been pressing the government to respond over all of those years. There's absolutely no conceivable reason to prevent them from having done so, at least since May 2021, when the last of the criminal trials collapsed. It's 2.5 years later and still no response. I can't understand what's been holding them up. It's an insult to Bishop James and the work that he did that there's been no response. And it's trying the patience of families who've already had to wait too long, and survivors, not to have had that response published. I keep hearing there's going to be a response soon. I really hope it's true, but I'm not holding my breath. Now, the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which has been carried over from the last session, does have proposals for a public advocate within it, which I've welcomed. But the Lord Chancellor knows that my view is that his proposals aren't sufficient to make the public advocate a useful way of preventing things from going wrong in future in the aftermath of disasters, but simply a signposting service for families caught up. Now, a signposting service is all well and good and it's welcome, but unfortunately it's not going far enough. There's a real opportunity here to make sure that families caught up in public disasters in future don't have to suffer the same experience as the Hillsborough families. His public advocate, though, has neither the independence nor the powers required to shift the dial in favour of families and to be able to act to torpedo cover-ups, which is the whole point. Furthermore, he's to be directed solely by the Secretary of State, which doesn't give him proper independence. Now, I'm going to keep trying when the bill comes back for its remaining stages in this place, which I hope will be before Christmas, to make positive changes to improve it, because otherwise it will be an opportunity spurned. So I hope that the government ministers on the front bench will give thought to improving the proposals as they currently stand, because if they're enacted as they currently stand, it simply won't be enough to make real use of the lessons to be learned from Hillsborough.
Sir Charles Walker.
Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me start by saying this. I've read the amendments on the order paper tonight, and if I could bring the hostages home and I could stop the fighting on the streets of Gaza, I would do it, and I would do it now. But the truth is, I can't, and no one in this House can. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am a legislator in our domestic parliament. So this afternoon, I want to speak out against the wickedness of anti-Semitism. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not acceptable for any community to be cowed or intimidated from displaying outward expressions of its faith, cowed through fear of violence. And let me be clear, whether that faith be Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, or any other faith, we allow people to express visibly their faith without fear of attack. And this is fundamental to this debate. It is not right for any British citizen to be held accountable for the actions of a government other than their own. My Jewish friends and neighbours are British citizens. That is what they are. Madam Deputy Speaker, last Friday I talked to a young Jewish doctor in the NHS, and she said, Charles, being Jewish in this country right now is very, very difficult. Not the exact words she chose, but the words I think I should use in the chamber. A synagogue in Maiden Vale on Saturday, worshippers leaving the synagogue were abused and suffered verbal threats. This synagogue is near where I grew up. It is near where I went to school. It is where many of my friends worshipped. It is not acceptable. Madam Deputy Speaker, a house in North London displaying a mezuzah was daubed in paint from top to bottom. Not acceptable. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, without equivocation or qualification, I say this. I stand with good and decent people of all faiths by the Jewish community. And if any Jews face harm, I and those people will place ourselves in front of those Jews to defend them from that harm. That is a solemn commitment on my behalf. Because the Jewish community in this country is small, 279,000. But it comprises my constituents, my family, and my friends. And they are deserving of my support, and they are deserving of all of our support. And I just want to get to the crux now of the law and order parts of this debate, because we have to deal with this as a parliament, and future parliaments will have to deal with it. Hate laws don't stop hate. We wish they would, but they don't. Hate is one of the basest of human emotions. It is the consumption that consumes the soul in the way cancer consumes our physical bodies. And I am desperate to see peace. I really am. I want to see peace in so many parts of the world. But what history has taught us is that peace is reached when the cost of hate is so great, when too many people have been killed, when sides are exhausted, when nobody can take it anymore. That is the moment that great men and women of courage and enlightenment stand up from both sides of that division, and they set their hatreds, their enmities aside, they embrace each other and hold out a hand. The world is a complicated, complex place. If there were simple solutions, we would have found them by now. They don't exist, Madam Deputy Speaker, but there is always hope. There is always hope on both sides of this House. We settle our arguments through debate, And we are also friends on both sides of the House. There is a big lesson in there for many, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Stevens.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be called early in this debate. I'm usually here a lot. I'm usually waiting a lot longer than that. So get on with it, says the Labour front bench. So thank you. In terms of justice, I hope the Minister heard from my honourable friend for Glasgow Central and the work that's being done in Scotland with the Violence Reduction Unit. I was a member of the Cross-Party Youth Violence Commission here in this place, and there is a lot of work in Scotland in relation to this, because it's also a public health issue, and yes, education and lifelong learning have its role in tackling that too, and I hope he will take that on board. Now, in terms of the King's speech itself, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been an extraordinary 5 days. It started off with a lot of the hard right-wing rhetoric, and now we see that the government's moved, or trying to move, to a centrist position. Quite extraordinary. And I listened to the Honourable Member for Northampton North, and I've heard others, and I hope that he will condemn the far-right thuggery that we saw at the weekend in London and elsewhere. These were not, as I've seen the phrase being used, counter-protesters. They were far-right thugs. And every single member of this chamber should condemn those individuals. Those individuals, Madam Deputy Speaker, who are wearing a poppy in their jackets and showing a swastika tattoo at the same time. An absolute outrage and, frankly, a despicable sight that we saw at the weekend. But there are, of course, other measures mentioned in the King's speech, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it will be obvious now after today's Supreme Court judgment that there will be yet another immigration bill. That annual event that takes place in this place since I've been here in 2015, in which there is yet another immigration bill to try and fix the broken asylum system that we have in this country. And I'm concerned, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I had my surgery on Friday in Govan, when I met a Palestinian constituent who has been denied asylum by the Home Office, who hasn't heard from his family in 10 days in Gaza, been denied refugee status in the United Kingdom. That tells me, Madam Deputy Speaker, how broken the asylum system actually is. And I hope that the Home Office will meet me to discuss that particular individual case. But what was most surprising about the King's speech was there was very little measures to tackle the cost of living crisis, or as I call it, the cost of greed crisis, which is taking place across these islands. It's interesting, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in America, President Joe Biden has launched a food poverty strategy to eliminate food poverty by the year 2030. And this government won't match that ambition here. And I certainly intend to table a bill because we need that strategy to eliminate food poverty. There are far too many of our citizens across these islands who are going hungry. And I think it's a disgrace that that's happening in an economy like ours. It's been left to the rest of us, Madam Deputy Speaker, to develop a community shop network, to sell food at affordable rates, to sell food at cost, to help people move away from food banks, the emergency need. And we need that sort of system, and we need the government to take food poverty in this country extremely seriously, because, as I've said, there are far too many who are in food poverty, including, I would say, far too many children. It makes me weep when I hear of some of the stories that are reported to my office who have to get the basic essentials. And we need essentials guarantees in the universal credit system, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's incredible that we have this ridiculous situation in which the universal credit system, which is there as a so-called safety net is no longer a safety net for many of the reasons, because universal credit and the social security system is also broken, and there were opportunities in the King's speech for the government to do that, and they sadly did not. I associate myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, with the remarks of the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee about infected blood and the lack of action that was in the King's speech. It's no longer good enough, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the government to sneak out statements just before recesses or prorogation to talk about the lack of action that's taking place for far too many people who've been caught up in that scandal. We'll continue to call that out, Madam Deputy Speaker. There needs to be debates in this chamber and statements regularly in this chamber for members of all sides to call the government to account for the slow pace and the snail's pace. And lastly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll be voting in the name of humanity, and I'll be supporting a ceasefire in the division lobby tonight.
Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a privilege to speak in today's debate around a theme that I know many of us care passionately about, and certainly our constituents care passionately about: reducing crime and restoring faith in our criminal justice system. And on that, I was very pleased to see the Victims and Prisoner Bill rolled over, as well as the introduction of the Criminal Justice Bill and the Sentencing Bill in the King's speech. And it's the Sentencing Bill on which I will focus my remarks today. Now, I've not been shy in outlining the key catalyst for my journey into politics, but I hope the House will forgive me for raising it once more, because it is very relevant for today's debate. For those of you who don't know, when I was 13 years old, my dad was killed by a single punch. One blow to the head and he was gone in seconds. He was 35 when it happened, and it's funny, at the time, I remember thinking not much about his age. He was my dad, so obviously he was just an old man. But now that I've reached the other side of 30, it kind of makes it all the more real and all the more stark. With no warning, on a cold February Friday night, he was gone, leaving behind me and my mum, and his own mother, my amazing Nan Sue, for whom my dad was her only child. Now, I don't want to talk about the perpetrator or go into detail about our specific case, but I really just want to outline the sheer devastation that this incident caused to my family. The families, the indirect victims of crime. And we may not have taken a physical blow, but the impact of the psychological blow will be with us for life, a true life sentence. Now, through a lengthy chain of events that followed, I had the privilege of being elected to this place and have made it my mission to raise awareness about the impact of single-punch assaults. Shortly, in a few weeks' time, One Punch UK, an incredible charity, will be launching their annual Punched Out Cold campaign to show in quite grisly but necessary detail the impact that violence can have, and reminding people that, yes, it's fine to go out over Christmas and have a few drinks and get a bit merry, but it is never the right time to raise your fists, and I hope that members across the House will help support in that campaign. But why do I talk about my family's experience again today? Well, one of the headlines in today's debate is around raising confidence in the criminal justice system. And through my work with One Punch UK, I know all too well that many families of the victims of single-punch assaults do not feel that the criminal justice system is on their side. Victim support is patchy and varied, and sentencing is felt to be far too low. Some would even say insultingly low. People have lost loved ones through these violent acts and have seen the perpetrator released within a year. Now, I know that no sentence will ever feel enough to make up for the loss of a loved one and the loss of all those future memories of what might have been, but we must do more to restore confidence in sentencing again. Now, there has been concern in the past around overly lenient sentences, and indeed, in 2014, the Sentencing Council was asked by the then Lord Chancellor to develop a guideline for one-punch manslaughter, and subsequently launched a consultation in 2017. In the 7 years prior to that, the average sentence for such offences was just 3 years and 10 months. Frankly, a kick in the teeth for the families of victims who are already going through so much. The new guidelines eventually came into force on the 1st of November 2018, but in my view still, sadly, do not go far enough. For single-punch assaults, the lowest possible sentence in the guidelines is just 12 months. 12 months where a life has been taken and where the families of victims do go through a life sentence. Now, that is for those with the lowest culpability, and the guidelines state that this is for cases where an unlawful act is committed, but where there was, and I quote, no intention to cause any harm and no obvious risk of anything other than minor harm. But I think many across the House would agree with me that that in itself is deeply flawed, because when throwing a punch, there is always an obvious risk of serious harm. And I and many one-punch assault campaigners I work with believe that sentencing for such assault should properly reflect that risk. So it is time for new thinking. That's why I would greatly welcome a discussion with the Justice Secretary and the new Justice Minister, who I warmly welcome to his new role, about how the new sentencing bill could include a specific minimum sentence for one-punch manslaughter that fully reflects the severity of the crime and reflects the real devastating impact on the families affected. I think that will be a concrete and tangible way that the government can restore and raise confidence in the criminal justice system for the families of past victims and, heaven forbid, for the future victims of single-punch assaults. Now, I have a little bit of time left, so more broadly, I would join the Chair of the Select Committee in welcoming the pragmatic approach being taken by the Lord Chancellor on sentencing, with the most serious offenders rightly spending more of their sentence behind bars for the sake of public protection, but whilst also focusing on the very real need for rehabilitation for lower-level offenders to, frankly, prevent petty criminals losing their own lives to a vicious cycle of reoffending and incarceration. We know that criminal justice and social justice go hand in hand, so I'm very pleased that the Ministry of Justice are taking such a pragmatic approach there. And I do look forward to supporting the Lord Chancellor and the entire Justice team on this legislative agenda moving forward.
Naz Shaw.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In today's King's Speech, I'll be speaking to proposed amendments H and R. As I stated publicly, the attack against innocent Israelis on October the 7th was an egregious crime against humanity. Families of those killed continue to mourn the loss of their loved ones, and the families of those taken hostage pray for their safe return. It would be a grave injustice to not recognise acts of terror committed by Hamas for what they are. In the same way, it would be a grave injustice in the world if the world turned a blind eye whilst innocent Palestinians are being murdered by the hour. More civilians killed in 6 weeks in Gaza than civilians killed in 20 months in the Russia-Ukraine war. More children killed in Gaza than the annual number of children killed across all conflict zones since 2019. More UN workers killed in Gaza than any comparable period in the UN's history. More journalists killed in Gaza than any conflict period since 1992. Hospitals have been bombed, refugee camps have been bombed, United Nations schools have been bombed, ambulances bombed, bakeries bombed, mosques and churches bombed, northern Gaza bombed, Gaza City bombed, Khan Yunis bombed, the Rafah border bombed, almost every inch of the Gaza Strip bombed. Over 11,000 innocent civilians killed. The hopes and dreams and futures of nearly 5,000 Palestinian children ended in mass graves. 2.3 million people fleeing death and destruction, babies dying in incubators, pregnant women having caesareans without anaesthetic. No fuel to power hospitals, no food to feed the living, and searching for clean water being as rare as searching for gold. Make no mistake, this is a humanitarian catastrophe, which is why I urge members to back an immediate ceasefire on all sides and push for the release of hostages. A call which is backed by 120 members of the UN Security Council, backed by 17 UN agencies, backed by the UN General Secretary, backed by the World Health Organization, backed by the World Food Programme, backed by Amnesty International, backed by over 600 leading international NGOs, including Oxfam, Save the Children, Christian Aid, Medical Aid for Palestinians, the International Committee for Refugees, backed by the Pope, backed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, backed by the overwhelming British public, and now backed by President Macron of France. Almost every single international aid agency in the entire world is saying a vital humanitarian aid to reach people cannot be delivered without a ceasefire. The very agencies whose expertise we rely upon in other conflicts and take their lead, so why not this time? We need a political solution to an issue which leads to peace, not one that ends in a way which is so horrific it emboldens more terror in the region. Injustice is the greatest barrier to peace, and the truth is we cannot expect peace unless we enable justice to be delivered. And nothing symbolises our British values better than the statue of Lady Justice towering over the Old Bailey. Figuratively blinded because justice is unbiased, the scales representing the impartiality of decisions, and the sword a symbol of power and justice. But when Israel acts with impunity and attacks hospitals, UN schools and refugee camps, and the case for Palestinians is vetoed by the US and the UK at the International Criminal Court, then the world asks, is our justice really unbiased? When we rightfully condemn extremist and genocidal statements by Hamas, but fail to utter a single word about the genocidal rhetoric being spouted by Netanyahu and his right-wing government, then the world asks, are our scales of justice truly impartial? When we follow the path of justice and the rule of law in the face of Putin's aggression, but yet Israel continues to defy UN resolutions with empty words and no action, then the world wonders, where is the sword of justice? When we fail to provide equal application of justice, then in the eyes of the world, it is one rule for the allies of the US and another for the rest. These are not my words, but the words uttered by the former Labour Foreign Secretary, the late Robin Cook, in this very chamber that sadly ring true 20 years on. Our values push us to do better, and this is why, despite all the risks to our personal positions, we must do what is right. Whilst it may be a matter of convention to follow our closest ally, the US, in interest of foreign policy, it is a matter of conscience to step away from our closest ally in the interest of peace. We know that eventually there will be a ceasefire in this current crisis. Every war ends with a cessation of hostilities. The question is not if there will be a ceasefire, but when. For the people of Palestine, every minute, every hour, every day we wait is another orphan, another grieving mother, and another family wiped out. This is why, in standing to save innocent lives of both Palestinians and Israelis and representing the people of Bradford West, in today's motion, I will be supporting the amendment which seeks an immediate ceasefire. Thank you.
It will be obvious to the whole House that a great many people wish to catch my eye this afternoon, so I will have to reduce, after the next speech, reduce the time limit to 5 minutes. But there's no point in people complaining. You come to me and tell me which of these people you want not to speak. We're talking about fairness here. Yes, okay. That was a rhetorical question. Stop digging. Right. But with 6 minutes, Mr. David Mundell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin, because a number of members have referenced the appalling practice of spiking, by commending my constituents Mandy and Colin Mackey, who have founded Spike Aware UK following the tragic death of their son Greg, who had his drink spiked. And I very much support their campaign to have a law criminalising spiking introduced both in Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Turning, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the gracious speech, there was much to welcome, particularly the strong focus on tackling crime and on keeping communities safe from crime and antisocial behaviour. The measures proposed to ensure tougher sentencing for the most serious offences and to increase the confidence of victims will, I am sure, receive strong support, not just from these benches but across the country. However, it is the case that the devolved nature of policing and justice in Scotland means that my own constituents and everyone living in Scotland will not automatically get the benefit of these changes. That would require equivalent action from the Scottish Government, who have responsibility for policing, tackling crime and the justice system, and the experience of my constituents and of communities across Scotland is that when it comes to these matters, SNP ministers promise big but deliver small. Take police numbers. The SNP government came to power in 2007 on a commitment to recruit and maintain 1,000 extra police officers over and above the 16,234 full-time equivalent officers that were then in place. 16 years later, the number of police officers in Scotland is a little over 16,000, right back to where we started from. In the words of David Kennedy, the General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, the state of affairs in Scotland for policing at the moment is pretty bleak. There are less cops on the street. If you ask around, people no longer see the police on the streets. From my own contact with constituents, I know just how much they value and respect the work of officers working in their communities. But time and time again, concerns have been raised with me that there is simply not an adequate number of police officers working within local communities to provide them with the reassurance they need and deserve. That's a clear message that I've been given most recently by local people in Peebles and Gretna in my constituency, where concerns have been put to me over the increased disorder and other types of antisocial behaviour. Continuing reports from these communities and others of antisocial behaviour, drug dealing and vandalism are worrying and clearly making life miserable for the law-abiding majority. There is no doubt that the Scottish Government have not been providing Police Scotland with the resources they need to properly respond to crime and be as visible as local people expect. The truth is that the SNP themselves know this is the case. Just a month ago, speaking in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP MSP for the South of Scotland, Emma Harper, said, "I understand that V Division in Dumfries and Galloway is struggling to meet the demands of its large rural region with the current number of officers. What specific action is being taken by the Scottish Government to recruit police officers to rural areas such as Dumfries and Galloway as a priority?" Ms Harper is entirely right to be asking why the Scottish Government hasn't taken urgent action needed to recruit and maintain police officers in communities like the one I represent. My constituency is covered by 3 different police divisions. In Dumfries and Galloway, there was a total resource complement of 392 officers in 2019. 3 years on, that has dropped to just 354. In Lanarkshire, there was a total complement of 1,404 3 years ago. It's now 1,366. And in Lothian and in Borders, there was a local complement of 946 officers in 2019, which has now fallen to 907. And it's the same picture right across Scotland. So I use this occasion to urge the Scottish Government to take a page from this King's speech and give a proper focus on keeping communities safe from crime and anti-social behaviour. Ensure tougher sentencing for the most serious offenders, rebalance the justice system to put the rights of victims over those of criminals, and restore the proud tradition of community policing, which has served constituencies like mine so well over the years, by giving our police the resources and increased manpower they need to do their job and keep local people safe.
We now come to a maiden speech. Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I start by thanking you and all the staff of the House for the very warm welcome I've received, for all their help as I'm so obviously lost around this building. I'm glad I chose a very quiet political day to give my maiden speech. But it is a pleasure to speak in this King's Speech debate and in a debate focused on improving our justice system. There's much we can do to talk more, not just about being tough on crime, but to understand the root causes and to tackle the underlying issues, not least the poverty of opportunity that leads so many into criminal activity. I spent several years before I qualified as a teacher working with young people involved in gangs and offending. They weren't bad people, they weren't born bad, They were people often without hope that their lives could be anything more than what they currently experienced. And when you lose hope, when your aspirations are limited by your experience, when you're unemployed or when you're excluded from school, it's any wonder that a gang starts to seem like a reasonable option. I'm glad that the police in England are learning from wonderful projects which my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow Central, has already mentioned in Scotland, like the Violence Reduction Unit, which I did a lot of work with. And the key to preventative projects like these is to continue investing, not to cut and run when crime stats go down. Prevention absolutely works, but for it to work, you have to keep on preventing. Mr. Speaker, it's an absolute honour to stand here as the Member of Parliament for Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Can I say to my honourable friend, the member for Selby and Ainstey, who gave his maiden speech a few weeks ago, he set the bar very high and somehow also managed to make me feel very old for having not been born before the 1997 general election. Although I should say I'm not too old, I was still aged in single digits when Tony Blair became the Prime Minister, something I think I share with the member for Mid-Bedfordshire, who gave another outstanding maiden speech yesterday. Similarly new to this place, I'd welcome the member for Tamworth to my own benches. It's getting to the point, Mr. Speaker, where we'll have a maiden speech every week. Perhaps a general election won't be necessary after all for Labour to form the next government. It's customary in a maiden speech to praise my predecessor, and I hope the House will permit me to praise predecessors. The cause of the by-election will not have eluded many members here, but I met countless people across the constituency who praised Margaret Ferrier's attention on matters of casework and local issues, and credit is due to her for that. Towards the end of her time in this place, she also started to give the honourable member for Strangford, who's not in his place for a change, a run for his money in her participation in debates, and I hope that I can match at least some of her parliamentary energy. I also want to pay tribute to my predecessors, Jed Killen and Tom Greatrix, and of course to Lord McAvoy for their dedication to the constituency over many years. Rutherglen and Hamilton West is a constituency steeped in industrial and political history. Rutherglen itself is one of the oldest royal boroughs in the land, granted its royal charter by King David in 1126, which means in 2026 Rutherglen celebrates its 900th anniversary, something the community is looking forward to marking. Blantyre was the home of David Livingstone, and the museum that stands where he grew up is not just a thriving monument to his life, but a reflection on his complex past as both an abolitionist and a fervent supporter of colonialism. And across the constituency, a legacy of coal mining, iron and steel making, such as the Clydebridge Steelworks in Cambuslang, which stands as a sad reminder of the industrial decline of communities like mine across the west of Scotland. And for a Labour MP, the roots of our founder, Keir Hardie, are in Lanarkshire, and it was in Rutherglen, then called Mid-Lanarkshire, in 1888, just a short century before I was born, that he first stood for election. For honourable members in the SNP, this area is also home of one of their most famous by-elections in 1967, the election of Winnie Ewing, who we sadly lost just a few months ago. And this seat also holds electoral history for another reason, and I thank the House of Commons Library for double-checking this. Until my by-election result, the last time Labour has ever taken a seat in a Scottish by-election was in 1964, in, of course, Rutherglen. Then the seat was taken from the Tories. This time around, it was the deposit that was taken from the Tories and not returned. I want to thank everyone who supported the by-election and all our volunteers, a campaign I'm proud to say that, unlike some other parties in this place, didn't rely on zero-hour contract leafleters to deliver our election material. But, Mr. Speaker, enough of history. Rutherglen and Hamilton West past is not all it can be proud of. It's a patchwork of vibrant communities, from Burnhill and Rutherglen in the west, on the border with Glasgow, to Fernhill and Whittlesburn in the south, stretching through Burnside, Cambuslang, Newton, Halfway, Blantyre and the western edges of Hamilton, who sadly are leaving the constituency in boundary changes. Some members may know of my somewhat irrational running challenge during lockdown, where I set out to run every single street in Glasgow, achieving it some 2 years and 2,300 kilometres later. I've set myself the challenge of now running every single street in my constituency, something I'd encourage all honourable members to do in their own patch, although it was a suggestion that was dismissed in horror by my colleague, the member for Edinburgh South, when I suggested we take it on together. On my way round the streets in a by-election that took 6 months, I met so many incredible people doing so much in their community. It's a constituency with a fantastic sense of pride, from the various gardening groups that brighten up the streets to the charities and organisations like LEAP or Healthy and Happy or the Fernhill Bingo or bowling clubs, or even Mo's famous shop in Blantyre, which operates more as a community centre than a shop. They do so much to bring the community together and reduce the social isolation that so many people feel, especially after the pandemic. It's a community full of hard-working, decent people who aren't ever shy in telling you what they think, as any journalist that was camped out in the main streets of my constituency will recall during the recall petition and the by-election. They want the absolute best for their community and their family. But they're also rightly angry, politically scunnered at being let down time and time again by governments distracted and divided at the very moment they need them most. Devolution promised us the chance to make decisions unique to Scotland in Scotland, but so often of late it's become a place not of the high ideals of public policy, but of manufactured grievance and division. Donald Dewar spoke of the Scottish Parliament as a means to revitalise our place in this, our United Kingdom. It feels to most Scots today that neither SNP nor Conservative is revitalising anything, and our slow, much too slow march towards social justice continues to elude far too many. My first contribution in this House was to ask the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to make work capability reflect the complexity of people with neurological conditions. It's a clause close to my heart, as is disability more generally. For far too many people, their potential is still limited by factors that are out with their control. Systems that we put in place so often hold people back. Complexity in the benefit system forces people into poverty and destitution. A fundamental lack of compassion and understanding stalls people's ambitions right at the moment it should be unlocking them. Another Lanarkshire Labour MP and a political hero of mine, John Smith, put it well in 1993. A choice between Labour's opportunity society, which invests, which educates, which cares, and the sad reality of neglect, division and rising crime that is Tory Britain today. A choice between Labour's commitment to democratic renewal, to rights, to citizenship, and John Major's centralised, secretive and shabby government. Fast forward 30 years and he could be talking about where we are today. A government that's incapable of delivering the change my constituents need. It's become fashionable of late, or perhaps it was always fashionable, to denigrate politics. It's not hard to see why people see our deliberations here as foreign to their daily lives. But I've also seen in the few short weeks I've been here, MPs from across this House championing causes that may only affect a few people, but affect them greatly. And as I used to tell my pupils when I was encouraging them to vote, politics changes our lives for better or ill, and it's our responsibility to engage with it meaningfully. I'd also say, having been elected, I was amazed to discover my former pupils took to TikTok to speak positively about me, which I have to say, working with teenagers is not necessarily guaranteed. But I'd also say, Mr. Speaker, on reflection, the behaviour that I sometimes used to complain about in the classroom, I'm discovering might actually have been more impressive than I thought since I arrived in this place. I have no doubt over the coming weeks and months I'll wrestle with complicated issues and seek to further my understanding of topics that I'll openly admit I need to know a lot more about. None of us has all the answers, although I suspect that may come as a surprise to some honourable members. But complexity shouldn't be something we shy away from. Nuance, which seems so lacking in our political discourse today, no doubt in part because of the role of social media, is an essential part of coming up with the common sense solutions that actually work for people. Being able to disagree without being disagreeable should not only be possible, but something we strive for. Mr. Speaker, with a general election on the horizon, who knows how long I might be sitting on these benches, at least on this side of the House. The opportunity to serve, as John Smith put it, is about putting our values into practice. And I don't want to be here just opposing the Tories, but on the other side replacing them. But, Mr Speaker, for every day I am here, I hope I can serve the people of my constituency well. I hope I have the confidence to stand up for those who are too often voiceless in our society, and at least try to change some of what holds so many people in my community back. This place is full of people with a wonderful calling, and I hope I can do the people who sent me here proud in the time that I have.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What a pleasure to follow the thoughtful eloquence of the new member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West. One of his predecessors, Tom Greatorex, shadowed me when I was the Energy Minister and became a great friend of mine, and I hope he might become a good friend too over time. When I was a boy, still younger than the honourable member for Selby, I attended my first Conservative Party conference in 1975, and Margaret Thatcher, the new Conservative leader, declared then that the first duty of government is to uphold the law. If it tries to bob and weave and duck around that duty, then so will the governed, and nothing is safe, not home, not liberty, not life itself. For a civilised society is an ordered society, and because it's the most vulnerable, the old, the frail, the less well-off that live on the front line of disorder, they must be protected from it. The honourable member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West spoke about the hopelessness that that can lead to when they feel that they are exactly that, on the front line of crime. For that reason, a prerequisite of social solidarity is a civil order where law is enforced, where justice prevails for all, where the guilty are punished. We must stand in defence of the gentle in this place. Yet too often in my lifetime, those who shape criminal justice have been impervious to the harm their doctrines do. Detached from the concerns of the hard-working people, too often people with power are influenced by guilt-ridden bourgeois liberals. Too much of this opinion-forming elite has lost a sense of proportion about what matters and what doesn't. They're able to gauge the insignificance of trivialities which waste time and resources, unable to tell the difference between the petty and the pertinent. Many people often believe rightly the criminal justice system is more interested in hurt feelings than the hurt that crime causes. People can't understand why elements in the police appear to care more about silly social media than they do about burglaries and theft. It is preposterous that half the calls passed on to frontline police in recent years have been about social media. Figures released in June revealed that the proportion of crimes resulting in a charge or summons was just 5.7%. By the way, that's a slight increase on last year. That means that 95% of crimes in England and Wales go unpunished, leaving aside those that don't even get reported. Meanwhile, in the 5 years to 2023, an incredible 120,000 people were recorded for non-crime hate incidents. Causing offence may be rude, but is it really worthy of police time? The liberal elite who offer a multitude of platitudes about equality are nonetheless content to see a two-tier justice system where cultural relativism determines what is investigated and what isn't. Whether it's eco-fanatics or Islamic extremists, the law must be applied equally to all. Well, you see, for such characters, in the absence of a sense of proportion, anything can be legitimised in the cause of self-righteous purity, including stopping ambulances taking the sick to hospital where they glue themselves to roads. We must end the culture, too, of excusing and then rewarding deviant and wicked behaviour. When I studied criminology at university in the 1980s, a seminal book, Rehabilitation and Deviance, showed that a rehabilitative ideal become institutionalised in the criminal justice system, that it had become disconnected from the core concept of justice. Crime is not an illness to be treated. It is a malevolent option chosen by those who carelessly harm and damage people, largely out of greed or spite,